Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's town hall conversation with City Manager candidate Carol Mitten, who is sitting behind me. Just a quick kind of overview of how we got to this point. After the, let's say, unsuccessful resolution of the most recent iteration of the city's city manager search, the council continued in its search, continued looking for candidates, speaking with candidates, had a number of interviews with a number of people, and ultimately determined to move forward with a single candidate who really impressed the council in a number of interviews, both collectively and in one-on-one discussions as well. Notwithstanding the fact that we only have one candidate in this position, we didn't want to move forward without first having an opportunity for her to meet the community, without having an opportunity to put questions to her in front of the community, and without hearing input from the community as well. And so that's why we're here tonight, and I appreciate everyone being a part of this evening. As you probably know, questions were sourced online prior to this evening. So I have a lot of them. I've sorted them and organized them in an effort to make sure that we have as efficient a mechanism as possible to get through as many topics of interest as possible. But additionally, there are index cards here, so folks who have additional questions, either that aren't being asked or that you maybe haven't submitted yet, feel free to submit those as well. I already have a few index cards this evening, which is great news. So we have a lot to talk about, so you don't need to hear much more from me. So the way that we're going to structure this, in order to make sure that everybody gets a chance to have their questions heard, so that there isn't, for instance, a situation where like, hey, 8 people in a row all ask similar questions and another question gets unanswered, is to filter the room. As, for example, is done in most candidate debates, as is done in most forums that I've done here as mayor as well. I think it's the best way to make sure that we hear from everybody. As you're going to hear, there's going to be plenty of tough questions. I think it would be kind of silly to pretend anything other than the case that a lot of the people in this room are relatively skeptical. I was guessing that beforehand, but it's been visible through the signs that I see as well. And plenty of skeptical people have submitted questions. I'm sure plenty more skeptical people will continue to submit questions if you don't feel that the concerns that brought you here are being represented. So it's going to be a lot of tough questions. I want to make sure that everybody has a chance, and I think this is the best format to achieve that, as we've discussed. No, for the very simple reason that when a bunch of people come to public comment, in order to keep it in a reasonable amount of time, they don't have time to say almost anything, and it's very unsatisfying to the public commenters. So this is the format that I think is going to give the community the best shot of asking all the questions that folks have and having real answers to those questions. And so I want to move forward with that. As I I appreciate that.
One more question for you. At the last town hall meeting, you said many questions. That's up to city council. So you couldn't answer those questions. It's up to council members to answer the questions. Are there going to be any council members here involved that can answer the questions that you're maybe not able to answer or don't want to? Or what are the council members that should be a part of this town hall?
Well, this is a town hall to interview the candidate who is up for consideration for city manager. So the questions won't be directed at me either. Council members are eligible to attend, though, of course, if more than 2 of them had attended, we would have had an Open Meetings Act violation on our hands, which I don't think anybody wanted that either. So I heard from a number of council members they're enthusiastically watching tonight on Zoom. I think it'll be a useful discussion for them to hear as well. And I think it's also best if we get on with the discussion because there are a lot of people here, there are a lot of questions that folks have, and there's a ton of different issues to discuss. So I'm going to turn around and turn into a public commenter myself, joining the rest of y'all. And like I said, Anybody who has questions that aren't being addressed, get a Nix card, get it up to me. Your issues will most definitely be addressed. So, welcome, Ms. Mitten. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your interest in this position and this community. I'm going to just start with giving you the floor. So, would like to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself, tell us about yourself, and if you like, tell us what's interesting to you about this position here as City Manager of Evanston.
Thank you. I did prepare something, and then if there's something that I left out that you'd like me to address, just ask me. I want to say first how happy I am to be here personally to introduce myself to the residents of Evanston. My sincere thanks to the mayor and all the city council members and the senior staff who've taken time to speak with me leading up to today. I'd like to introduce myself differently than I usually do in a professional setting, since there's a lot of information circulating out of Urbana that suggests things about me that are simply not true. The individuals who are spreading this information have a clear agenda, and that agenda means more to them than facts. Most people in Urbana have recognized this and ignore what they say and what they write. In fact, I was recently confirmed again as Urbana's city administrator, and no member of the public spoke against me, at least not on the record, including the people who've been providing the information out of Urbana. So if you want to know about me, I ask that you consider the things I've actually done, not the things that someone represents to you that I have done. Ask for the whole story and know the reliability of the sources you choose to believe. If you do, I think you will find that my values are very much aligned with those of Evanston. I'm going to highlight specifically how diversity, respect for different views, and public engagement have been woven through my professional life. So here's me. When I got out of graduate school, I had job offers in 3 different cities: Detroit, Buffalo, and Washington, D.C. Detroit and Buffalo were very familiar to me because they were Rust Belt cities, and I'm from Cleveland. I chose D.C. because it was so very different. At the time I moved to Washington, the majority of the population was black, around 70%, and very urban, which was a big change for me. I grew up in the suburbs, and I loved the diversity. The population is very transient, and I would meet people from all different parts of the United States and the world. Before getting into local government, I worked for 20 years as a commercial real estate appraiser in D.C., and the last 10 as the owner of my own firm with a national reputation in appraising historic properties. My path into government didn't start with a job, though. It started with civic activism. I lived in a co-op apartment downtown, and our apartment building was surrounded by office buildings. A developer was proposing a planned unit development on our block, and I became the spokesperson for my building. I spent about a year on behalf of my neighbors trying to get the zoning commission to force changes to the PUD that we thought were very reasonable. We ended up losing the zoning commission vote, but I learned a lot about public process through that experience. For example, the developer who was actually represented by a lawyer who was a client of mine, and I remember him implying that there would be a potential loss of business because of my taking up this role. As you can imagine, that was not a comfortable feeling, and I've always strived to ensure that citizens sharing their views or defending their positions be able to do that freely and without fear of consequences. That is their right. During that case, I also spent a lot of time very respectfully voicing my concerns to the Office of Boards and Commissions about the practice of the Zoning Commission, most notably a lack of transparency. As a reward or perhaps punishment for my constructive feedback, I was offered the next vacant position on the commission by D.C. Mayor Anthony Williams. I had a unique perspective in that I was a community activist who also understood the business community. I ended up serving on the Zoning Commission for 8 years, and I was the chair for 7 of those years. I was responsible for presiding over meetings and making sure that not only was everyone heard, but that everyone felt heard. Did that mean everyone always agreed with me or that I always agreed with them? No. But everyone knew how I had reached my decision. In fact, all of my colleagues were very good about explaining themselves. It was a commitment that we had made to each other and to the public, to be clear. After my first term on the Zoning Commission, Mayor Williams appointed me to the director of the Office of Property Management. As director, I oversaw a sprawling agency with its own security force, tasked with managing the city's real estate portfolio. What is notable is that all the people in my chain of command, the mayor, the city administrator, Robert Bobb, and the deputy mayor for operations, Herb Tillery, were all black men. Racial and cultural diversity was a given working for them. As director, I also launched a labor management partnership that empowered frontline employees, many of whom were minorities. My agency staff included 2 deputies, one of whom was a black female, and 5 division heads, all of whom were black or Asian. After my DC government assignment, and while I was working as chief of lands for the National Park Service National Capital Region, I was recruited to work for the Department of Homeland Security. DHS was going to build a consolidated headquarters to replace the cobbled together facilities that they had occupied immediately after 9/11. The location they selected was 200 acres of federally owned land that was the site of a former psychiatric hospital known as St. Elizabeth's. St. E's is located in Ward 8, which is a predominantly black ward with historically high unemployment and income levels significantly below the rest of the city. I was recruited because of the relationships that I had developed in that ward with black leaders and community activists through my work on the Zoning Commission and elsewhere. My mission was to ensure that development of the campus benefited the community at large, that employment opportunities were made available to residents, and that longtime homeowners and renters weren't displaced from the neighborhood. Also, during my tenure at DHS, I participated in their mentoring program for aspiring executives, and I had 2 mentees, both of whom were black. After DHS, I worked in Arlington County, Virginia, as a deputy county manager. Arlington County shares many of the progressive ideals that Evanston has. Promoting diversity and inclusion was and remains a baseline expectation of leadership there, as well as robust community engagement. I oversaw the department that included the sustainability staff, and Arlington is known for some of the most thoughtful land use and transportation planning in the country. I also oversaw the Economic Development Office, and during my time there, we significantly reduced the office vacancy rate using a strategy that played on the county's strengths in various tech sectors, as well as proximity to the U.S. Capitol. And then finally, for the past 4 years, I have been the city administrator for the city of Urbana. I was drawn to Urbana because it is a progressive community. One of the big handicaps in Urbana, though, is limited resources available to promote forward-thinking ideals. We have actively pushed to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything we do as resources allow. It's an unfortunate reality that the pursuit of progressive goals can be time-consuming and expensive. For many communities, it is simply beyond their reach, despite everyone's best efforts. By contrast, Evanston is in the very enviable position of having the vision, commitment, and resources to effect real change. Beyond that, we have achieved many wonderful things in Urbana over the past 4 years, and I look forward to talking about some of these achievements with you this evening. As someone who has worked across the spectrum from private industry to the federal government, I know that the most interesting and impactful work for me personally is in local government. I hope to bring my experience and commitment to good governance to the city of Evanston. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the way we're going to do this is I've got a big stack of packets of questions that were submitted in advance. We're going to work our way through them. They're roughly organized from sort of most frequently asked to least frequently asked, and now I have a significant and growing stack of questions that have been handed in here. So at some point we may jump, at some point we will jump from pre-asked to asked tonight, but I want to begin with some of the themes that came up in the questions that were asked online.
Okay.
The first is kind of, I would say almost redundant with what we've already talked about, but I think worth asking in these words. Please talk about your current ideas and impressions of the Evanston community, and what about that has attracted you to want the job as our city manager?
It's very important to me, and it's become increasingly important to me as I've progressed through my career in local government, because if you're going to be in this kind of job, you have to live in the community where you work. And I don't want to live in a community that is not a progressive community, and that means that I don't want to work in a community that's not a progressive community. So for me, it goes hand in hand. That's a really important thing about Evanston. I hear nothing but good things about Evanston. The people here, strangers, have been just so nice. And that's coming from Urbana, where, it's true Midwest, but people here are outgoing and engaging. And, what I've also heard is that you have a very intelligent community, and people like to get engaged and they like to be involved. And I think that's great, because sometimes there's very important things happening and there's no dialogue, and we're really left wondering, what does the community want? What does the community think? And so to have people that are willing to engage and come out and, have that make that contribution to their civic life is really important. And it gives, I think it's essential to good decision making. So that's, I think that Evanston is a place that reflects the way that I want to live and engage in a community, and a place that I think I could be productive in working here.
Thank you. So by far the largest number of questions were about kind of community engagement, community involvement, and transparency. And again, there's no sense in pretending. Some of those questions were phrased in a neutral way, and some were phrased in a relatively hostile way. And so what I'm going to start by doing is just kind of reading off the ones that were phrased in a neutral way, and just give you an opportunity to speak to the issue. And then we may have some follow-ups that are kind of a bit more pointed about some accusations that have been made about situations in Urbana. So
Okay.
The neutral ones read as follows. Please give some examples of what you've done in prior jobs to build open and collaborative relationships with the general public. How important do you believe it is in your position to facilitate and encourage public participation and input? Please describe your track record in prior jobs of building a collaborative and trusting relationship with residents. And please speak to your feelings on transparency in government and how you have demonstrated this in your previous roles. So, subtle differences between those questions,
Sure.
let's say.
Well, I think there's, in various capacities in the past, whether it's been in working in, less so in DC government, because we were more of an internal support agency, but certainly at the Zoning Commission, I've presided over hundreds of public hearings and meetings, and so that was part of that role. When I was in Arlington, there were many opportunities. I distinctly remember we were working on a fire station, and whether we were going to relocate the fire station or whether we were going to try to rebuild it in place. And there was a lot of public engagement around that. And then there was eventually a group of people that were brought together to sort of an advisory group. And I think there's oftentimes a place for that, especially if there's if something is very that the community has a very unique voice. Sometimes if there are things like in Arlington, there was a sustainability group that was very involved, and there were people that had actual expertise in different areas, and we were able to take advantage of their expertise. They were kind of an advisory group. I don't recall the name of it exactly, but people that knew about that worked as engineers or worked in the sustainability field, and we took big advantage of the expertise that was available in the community in an advisory capacity.
Great. Thank you. So let me ask then a more pointed question, which reads as follows. A quick internet search shows a lot of complaints from residents in your current role, stemming from your attempt to curb transparency in government. How do you address those complaints, and how would you ensure transparency in Evanston?
So I can only guess at what the specifics of that are. So I'm okay. I need to give a little context if I'm going to speak to Aaliyah Lewis.
This is not you're not running for president. This isn't a debate. You're not a 90-second timer.
No, I understand.
Take your time. Take
Yeah.
the time you need to explain what needs to be explained. That's what
Yeah.
people are here. Absolutely.
So on April 10th, 2020, we had a use of force incident that involved the young lady whose name was just mentioned, and it was videotaped by several bystanders, and then that was posted. And out of that incident, There were 3 officers that were considered to be directly involved. The only person that got hurt was a police officer. The only, what do I want to say? The only uses of force that were used were determined to be, they were each a single technique that was used one time to gain the compliance of Ms. Lewis to be arrested. And then there was a lot of outcry from the community around that. And so we hired an outside firm to evaluate and determine whether, in fact, the police chief's conclusion that no policies had been violated whether they agreed with that. So they did an investigation, and all of that material all the material that's available to the public is posted online. The videos of the incident are posted online. And some members of the public were not satisfied with the results of that. They found that, again, that they agreed with the police chief that no policies had been violated, but they did make some recommendations. And one of I would say the most important recommendation that came out of it is that we revise our use of force policy, and that we very specifically articulate our commitment to de-escalation. And we have had a longstanding commitment to de-escalation, but it wasn't articulated in the policy, but it was reflected in the training that the officers receive. So that's the upshot of that incident. There are people who believe that the outside investigation was not satisfactory. There were people who believed that the police officers should be disciplined, but because they did not violate any policies, there was no discipline that was appropriate. And there were many opportunities. We had town halls where people could give feedback, and we had a number of occasions where we discussed the use of force policy with the council, even though that's not a policy that the council votes on. We ended up adopting the 10 shared principles that have been put forward by the NAACP and the Illinois Chiefs of Police around a commitment to more, more sensitive policing. So there's a lot of good things that came out of the incident, but not everybody was satisfied with it.
And then can you go on and responding to can you then go on and respond to the original question, just say more about the fact that can you, So I think if we're going to have a constructive evening, we have to make sure that we give in particular Ms. Mitten, a chance to respond to the questions. I think that there's ample time to ask all the questions we want to ask, but I know that folks want to hear the answers to the questions as well, and so I think it's really critical that we give the space for that to occur. So I want to refer back then to the question that I read off. There have been, and you were sort of, I think, starting to answer, there have been complaints about, allegations about a lack of transparency, either regarding compliance with the Open Meetings Act or the Freedom of Information Act or perhaps other things as well. What's your response to that?
Well, there's been various complaints over time. We have certain people that are not satisfied with our application of FOIA exemptions. We have a commitment. There are some jurisdictions, let me just say, there are some jurisdictions that do no rejections whatsoever except the ones that are required by law. We have a commitment to maintaining people's privacy when it's appropriate and when it's allowed under FOIA. So we've had FOIAs that have basically been back doors to try to find out, who's been complaining about whom and so forth. And we protect people then. We protect deliberative content inside, when staff is exchanging, drafts and so forth. That's typical things that we don't disclose. In terms of, I'm trying to think of some of the complaints that we've had about OMA violations. I might have to come back to that one. But
The one I've heard about a lot is, I guess there was an opinion issued by the Illinois Attorney General that there was a violation of the OMA. Can you tell us about that?
I'm just going to need a little prompt. I can tell you one lawsuit that we settled. It wasn't. Maybe this was considered an OMA violation. We had, after the incident on April 10th, April 10th, 2020, a lot of members of the community became very engaged in coming to council, and it was a time, if you remember, that's when COVID really started to kick in, and so we had shifted to a Zoom format. And there was a lot of hostility, and I mean very hostile behavior being directed at staff, being directed at various people, various members of staff, and things were being said directed towards individual members of staff that were in the vein of incompetence, lying, corruption, and so forth. And this was like naming people and saying these things about them. And it was and the effect that it was having, this is just context for what I'm about to explain. And the effect that it was having was staff members were very upset. They were very frightened, some of them. And it wasn't even just the staff members who were the target of those things. It was other staff members were being upset by this behavior and by these comments that people were making. And we were losing we felt that we had lost the civility of the public space that we create when we take public comment at the council meeting. And so we had, because staff was getting increasingly upset and we were kind of at a loss what to do, we talked through with our city attorney, is there anything that we could do? And he advised us that we could, turned out to be wrong, but he advised us that we could ask people, put it in our public input rules, like that you can't name a staff person. You could say, staff did this. I think staff is incompetent, but not, I think Mary Smith is incompetent. And we had been advised that we could put those kind of rules in place. And we did so, and that was and some of you may have seen, I weighed in, and I was very concerned because the behaviors that we were seeing, my interpretation of them was that it was an effort to bully our staff, and it was really having a detrimental effect on morale. So, with the advice of the city attorney, we put these new public input rules in place, and then we got sued. And so that actually was voted on by council. So it was, the mayor put those rules forward, council voted on them. As I recall, there was maybe one dissenting vote. We put the rules in place, and then we got sued. And then once we had a weigh-in from outside counsel who said that you really can't restrict speech in that way, then we settled that lawsuit and changed our public input rules. So we learned a hard lesson, but it was, and I still struggle sometimes with how to protect staff and how to create an environment that is civil, given that it's their workspace, and they're entitled to not work in a hostile work environment.
So let me ask a follow-up question. And then just to be candid, this is something that I struggle with. I think we all struggle with. You know, I'm the mayor. I ran for mayor on purpose, I guess, and then became the mayor. And so I signed up for, there's I would say, no level of nonviolent abuse that I didn't sign up for and that I don't have a responsibility to accept. Like that's people have a really important right to share their views with me about anything about the city in whatever kind of language and style they want to share them. You as a city administrator now, perhaps the city manager in Evanston, you didn't run for office, but you're the kind of the head of the organization in a relatively public role. So you didn't sign up for quite the same level of public criticism, but did sign up for a high level of public criticism. Our low-level staff obviously didn't, but then again, they work in public service, so there's some level of public criticism that a frontline staffer at a municipal government did sign up for that's different than what a frontline staffer in a private business would have signed up for. So that's already a little bit thorny. But then several residents have raised an issue that makes this much more kind of concrete and emotional here in Evanston. I have no doubt that you've read about the horrifying scandal that occurred over the course of a number of years, it turns out,
Yes.
Of terrible, terrible sexual misconduct among lakefront employees. And so the question then is, there are also, rarely, but nonetheless, real incidents when a member of rank and file staff is in need of serious criticism.
Yes.
And so as you're trying to strike this balance, which I think we can all agree is a tough balance to strike in the first place, how do you do it in a way that doesn't open the organization up to the risk that really important criticism that needs to be surfaced instead gets stifled? How do you solve that?
Well, I think it's a question of degree, and so first thing I was thinking about that I wanted to say about why members of the community need to care about what employees their reaction to how people treat them is that they can leave. And this is something that we're struggling with in Urbana, which is people left because of the way that they were treated in the city council meetings. And so and not everybody's wired the same. So I have a very high tolerance for personal criticism. Other people don't. And so, I actually, I'll give you a very concrete example. We were recruiting for a certain position. I'm not going to say which one because then you'll know the individual I'm speaking about, and I'd rather not do that. But for the very first time in recruiting for this position, I had to say, are you prepared? We're interviewing people. Are you prepared to be personally attacked in a city council meeting or in a commission or board meeting? Are you prepared for that? And people were like, whoa, I'm not sure I want to work here. But that's becoming a baseline question that we have to ask people. And so the reason that the citizens or the residents of Urbana should care is that some people will say no. And is that really how you want to, do you want to lose talent because they're not willing to subject themselves to that? That being said, so it's a question of degree, right? If somebody does something that's actually heinous, which is what the scandal was around, I think it's all the gloves can come off. But when it's just routine or it's not a major incident, to just make it, we have endured a lot of really caustic criticism of staff over, I'm going to say, relatively minor things. They might not seem minor to the individuals involved, but I go back to, I think some of the individuals involved, their goal is to bully staff. And so I think that's worth talking about.
And I guess just the last, and I'm sorry, but we'll move on from this topic, but there's a lot of questions about it, and I don't want to give it short shrift. Obviously, we all agree that if something's truly heinous, something profoundly immoral, something in this instance likely illegal is occurring, of course it should be surfaced. What tools do you put in place to make sure that the protections you've already set up don't catch something like that? So how do you make sure that how do you make sure that comes through and gets heard and gets taken seriously, while other kinds of attacks on staff don't, essentially?
I want to say what I think I heard you ask me, which is,
Yeah, it was not the world's most clear question.
how do those really serious things get through?
How do you make absolutely sure those serious things get through? How do you set up a system where no matter what else you're doing, no matter who you're trying to protect for very good reasons, we can still be absolutely sure that when something is serious, it doesn't get bottled up, it doesn't get ignored, it doesn't get cast aside?
Well, I guess I question, and I think this might have been part of the situation, which is it wasn't through the normal channels, like, telling the people who were in charge. That was not resulting in any, that was not getting the results that people were thinking. So then the only option was to go into a public setting. I think that's probably fair game. My philosophy with department heads and really anybody that has worked for me is I operate under a no surprises rule, which is if you've got problems, if you've got issues, tell me. We can't fix them if you don't tell me. So what I got out of what I read about the lifeguard situation was that people were suppressing information. They weren't bringing it up through the channels, and that was just absolutely wrong.
All right. So there's, I don't think we're going to get very far this evening if we don't allow for questions and answers both. So the next topic, I would say the next topic with the most questions on it by far was around questions of racial equity. So for instance, can you tell us about work you've done in your current or former positions to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion? How have you incorporated an anti-racist lens and done the work of anti-racism at your prior jobs? What is your understanding of anti-racism and how would you apply it to the job of Evanston City Manager? I would add to that, we have sort of remarkably a vacancy in the person in charge of equity here in the city of Evanston. That's a critical hire for the next city manager. How do you empower that position in a way that enables the person in that role to do the work that the city needs to get done?
So I'll talk about what I've done and dovetail that into answering that question. So while I've been in Urbana, we recast the role of what had been the human rights officer into a human rights and equity officer, and that position had been a part-time position, and when we recast it, we made it a full-time position and recruited someone who's very experienced, and she's now a member of the cabinet, and the cabinet is traditionally just department heads and then a few managers like the IT manager, but our human rights and equity officer is part of cabinet because it's an important position. It's a leadership position, even though it might not be a leader of a lot of staff. It's a position that needs to be at the table when the serious conversations are taking place, and this person makes themselves available to all members of staff. She gets included in some of the interviews for different positions. People really take advantage of bringing her in to help make sure that we are thinking about making sure that we're thinking about diversity and inclusion as we do various activities. I personally have worked with her. She now reports to me. That position was part of HR previously. She's also, we have sort of a, I'm going to say we're starting to develop a program that mirrors a program that Champaign has. They have this, it's for Champaign, it's called CDAP. It's Champaign Diversity Advancement Program, and it's around minority contracting, minority, women-owned, veteran-owned business contracting. And so the Human Rights and Equity Officer and I and another staff member who works in economic development have been working very closely trying to develop this program in a way that works for Urbana. Champaign has a lot more resources than we do, so their program is a lot more robust, but we're working on trying to integrate that more and do more very intentional things that will improve. I can give you I'd like to give you a specific example that will improve our track record on minority, women-owned, and veteran-owned business contracting. So we were recently going out for janitorial services, and the CDAP from Champaign, it's a list, part of it is it's a list of contractors in these categories. And so there were a lot of people that do janitorial, so I had asked the folks at Public Works to do a couple things. One was, can you break the procurement into smaller pieces so that maybe someone who's a smaller firm could be more competitive as opposed to try to bid on the whole thing. And then I asked them to make sure that all of the firms that were on the CDAP list that said they did janitorial work, that they got a copy of the request for proposals. And then they actually went a step further and they did follow-up calls to make sure that they all knew and did they need any help in putting together a proposal. Unfortunately, nobody on the list bid. Nobody that was on the CDAP list bid, but that's the kinds of things that we need to do. We don't have people dedicated to procurement in Urbana. They do in Champaign. Each department has its own procurement person. In district government, there's a whole department, Office of Contracting and Procurement. So it's we're doing the best we can, but it's those kinds of things that we're making efforts, we're making headway at a time when there's all the baseline work of managing complaints that come into the Human Rights and Equity Office for people that say they've been discriminated against in various ways. So we're making some headway, but we're limited in our resources.
Thank you. The next set of questions are all about environmental sustainability. I would say the umbrella is what steps you would recommend taking to comply with our climate action and resilience plan. And then the specific question that I'll read is, what are your thoughts on the best way to hit Evanston's 2030 goal of 100% renewable energy usage? So I'm not going to say that I have a deep knowledge of your, I think it's called your CARP, but what I do know about it is that I think it needs to evolve, and so it's a starting place that a lot of communities have. It was true. It was the same starting place that they had in Arlington County, which is what I call unconstrained planning. So unconstrained by financial considerations, which is a great place to start, right? You want to start like, what's the universe? How are we going to tackle this? How are we going to manage this? And so the plan talks about different types of areas where progress can be made, but the next step in that, and so then you have a goal that's set, but really no roadmap to get there, or no bank account that is segregated to get there, and so that's the next step that needs to take place. So when I was in Arlington County, part of the large public works department that I oversaw was a group called AIRE, which is AIRE, Arlington's
Arlington something to reimagine energy. Arlington something to reimagine energy. And so they had the community energy plan, and they had a variety of things in the community energy plan, and they had the typical low-hanging fruit to meet the goals in the early part of the plan, and then there was a really steep curve to get to the end goal with no idea about how to do it. So what's been interesting is watching that evolve, and now they updated the plan a couple years ago, and now the next part of that, their short-term efforts are they need to create an actual roadmap, like what investments do we need to make in order to achieve the goal that we set for ourselves, and then what goes with that is financial considerations. I mean, when I was in Arlington, one of the things that they had said they would explore was something called district energy. I don't know if that's a term of art or that's just a term that they created, but the idea was to sort of like, I don't know how Northwestern is, but campuses will have like a centralized heating plant or something. So the idea was, are there places where we could have building owners kind of join together, and instead of everybody having their own heating and cooling plants, that they would work as a district? And there were actually some places where there's an area called Crystal City, and there was one office building owner who had a lot of buildings. So, because you need everybody to join together, easier if they're all owned by the same. But we explored that at great length, and it just didn't pencil out. And so you either decide you're going to do something that doesn't make economic sense because it meets your goal, or you've got to make the business case, particularly if you're trying to include, the business community. So I think what needs to happen is there need to be actual concrete steps determined that I'm not smart enough to know, but I'm sure you have people on staff and consultants that can help figure out what those concrete steps are. And then you need to have a capital plan that goes with it to say, what's the investment required to get there? And that's the piece that's a big piece that's missing.
Thank you. As I indicated, a bunch of people took the time to submit questions online during the course of the past week. I've condensed them as much as I can. I'll keep on condensing them down. And there's a bunch of cards that we're going to go through as well. We have the ability to do both, and I think it would be disrespectful to the folks who submitted questions to just skip them because they didn't write them down tonight. So the we'll stay here for as long as it takes. As I indicated, I had 10 prepared collections of questions, and now I have this giant stack of index cards that I'm feverishly trying to organize. So thank you for that. I'm feverishly trying to sort them so that we can have this all happen as efficiently as possible. Speaking of things for me to apologize, I apologize if I don't read this next question well, but it's asked in Spanish. La vivienda es importante para recibir recursos de calidad, al igual que las personas se sientan seguras. ¿Qué acciones tomará para la creación de viviendas asequibles? The asker talks about the importance of housing for basic quality of life and safety, and asks what actions you can take to create affordable housing. And it's mixed in with a lot of other questions about affordable housing, about gentrification, which is a profound concern in the Evanston community. As well as, and let me just read one of these cards to do some consolidation, as well as asking what have you done in Urbana to support naturally occurring affordable housing and support local small landlords?
Okay. The affordable housing issue is huge, and the more affluent the community, the more difficult it is. So Washington, D.C., where I lived, very affluent, also there are areas that are not affluent. In Arlington County, where I worked, also very affluent. In DC, what they did was they created a dedicated source of revenue to go into something called the Housing Production Trust Fund. And they have produced a lot of affordable housing in DC using the Housing Production Trust Fund. I don't know how many units, but a lot. But a dedicated source of funding. And they've leveraged that with various other monies like CDBG and things like that. In Arlington County, they did, they're very good about planning, and so they did a study that took place over a couple of years to actually, kind of assess what's the state of play for affordable housing and different levels of affordable housing. And and affordability can be, sort of, this is my word. I don't know that this is the right word. Transient. It's temporary. It's got a 20-year life or whatever. Then there's other things that are permanent, affordable. So they took the inventory of all of that, and then they made a projection on, okay, we want to have, in order to have a community that is diverse from an economic perspective, how many permanent affordable housing units are we going to need by, I don't know what the out year is, but it's 2030, 2040, very similar to a goal for the Climate Action Plan. You have a goal, you want to achieve the goal. Then Arlington decided, okay, what's our investment that we need to do every year in order to add units in order to meet that goal? And then they determined how much that would cost and how much they needed to invest every year in order to do that. So it's not inspired, but that's what it takes. And then you have to layer all these different demands on top of each other. So, because sometimes there's different sources of funding for these things, but sometimes they need to be supplemented with general fund dollars. And so then all these very good things are competing with each other. So I happen to know that you are, I guess, on the cusp of embarking on a new comprehensive plan. And a comprehensive plan is an ideal place to integrate all of that, right? Because the comprehensive plan is the vision, and then each of the things that you want to achieve needs an implementation plan, and then you have to stack up the implementation plans and say, how are we going to prioritize our resources, because they're not unlimited. So it takes investment. It takes deliberate investment to preserve and create affordable housing. Naturally occurring affordable housing in Urbana and local small landlords. I got a little statistic the other day from one of the people working on the comprehensive plan, because I really wanted to understand a little bit better about affordability in Urbana. And 75% of our housing is affordable to people at 80% AMI. So that's really very affordable. I mean, by and large, housing is, in the scheme of things, affordable in Urbana. I think 45 or 50% was affordable to people at 60% of AMI. So our challenge is really to go deeper, but we don't have anything that is specifically targeted to supporting small landlords, but we do have programs that are CDBG type programs that are that support people who are low income and own a home and want to make investments in their home.
Great, thank you. And just, warning, if you wind up here, I'm afraid our data are not what you just shared in Urbana, and we do have a much bigger problem when it comes to naturally occurring affordable housing, and so it's a big topic here.
Sure.
Next bucket of questions is about economic development. What would be your approach and priorities to address the retail vacancies downtown, and how have you facilitated economic development in Urbana?
I'm going to take the second one first. In case I'll say it again in case you you didn't get it like the first 10 times I said it. We run real lean in Urbana, so we don't have a robust economic development staff. We have an economic development manager and an economic development coordinator, but it's really important. So we work as a team, and the mayor is part of the group. I am part of the group. The economic development people are part of the group. The head of community development is part of the group. We've recently been joined by the chief planner and a management analyst that reports to me who had been involved in economic development, and we work as a team. So we're in this place in Urbana between sort of post-COVID, or we fancy that it's post-COVID, or changed from what had been the norm for the past couple of years, where we're coming out of it, and then pre-comprehensive plan being done, right? So we really don't have new plans for like, what are we going to do downtown? Because that would presumably come out of, and our downtown is a lot smaller than yours, that would presumably come out of the comprehensive plan, which doesn't mean we don't have plans. So what we decided to do was to focus our energies, because there's so few people to actually address economic development. We really needed to focus on targeted areas, and so we had 3 TIFs. So we're going to focus on those. We have a hotel that's a historic hotel in downtown Urbana. If you've ever been there, it was the old Jumers, and it's been really just sitting vacant for way too long. And we have a developer that's developing that into a Hilton Tapestry, and we're hoping it'd be done by the end of the year. So we also want to invest to make sure that investment, we leverage that investment and the people that will be coming because of the hotel. And then there's another area that is that has sort of an anchor, and there's a small shopping center near there, and so that's another focus of development because there's land available in all of these places. So what we've been doing is we've done some tweaking to some of our programs in terms of like grant assistance that we provide. Some of the grants were not being particularly productive, so we've changed those. Trying to be a lot more rigorous about not just giving money away, but making sure that the loop gets closed. That we don't just give the money away, but that we actually have an expectation that that's going to benefit the city and come back in multiples. So in terms of the economic development here and the retail vacancy that you have, first I can imagine why, but I wouldn't want to take for granted why. So I'd actually want to survey people, maybe people that had closed businesses or people that were still in business but maybe struggling and so forth. One of the, I guess, obvious things that I've heard from people is that because the office vacancy rate is up and you don't have those office workers there, the demand for certain retailers has gone, and that's why retail vacancy is up. I think there's a very hard conversation that probably needs to take place, as did in Arlington when I was working there. We worked a lot to bring the office vacancy rate down, but then we had this group of office buildings that were class B minus, C, and less. So not the nicest office buildings that were really not. They weren't geared towards redevelopment into Class A office space, and that's what the demand was for. So we had to come up with, okay, we have to make peace with the fact that we need to renovate these things into something else. So the obvious thing is to do residential, although in Arlington there was a lot of demand for school space. So I think at least one of those office buildings became a school. But I think there needs to be a hard conversation if this, in fact, this is being, the retail vacancy is being driven by a lack of office workers, about what the second life of some of these office buildings will be.
It's safety downtown is the issue.
Thank you.
Okay.
The next couple questions are about Northwestern. They point out that you are currently working in a city with a big university, albeit a public university. And their question is basically, what strategies would you have to address the relationship between the city and the university, and quite frankly, to advance the cause of getting financial support for the city from the university, which, of course, as you know, is not a property taxpayer.
Yes. Well, it's really interesting. Obviously I do work in Urbana and there's the U of I, but when I was in DC, I mean, there's lots of universities in DC. It's not the same level of dependency, but what was really interesting about it, each of the universities has their own personality, right? And that personality is driven by the culture of the university, but in some ways it's driven by the president of the university. So to me, it's a lot about relationships. I mean, we have a lot of relationships with the U of I, and they're in different capacities, right? So like our public works people deal with the public works folks, the facilities folks from the university. And that's one level. We provide fire protection. The university pays the city of Urbana. They built a fire station on campus. We staff it. They pay for us to staff it. But in terms of, I think it's about relationships, honestly, when you boil it down, and having that, whatever direction you want to give, what the leadership wants to give about the relationship that they want to have with the university, whichever it is, U of I or Northwestern or whatever, that has to permeate all the other relationships that exist so that there's a continuity, and that should be the same. The expectation should be the same. How do we treat each other? Do we, for instance, I'll give an example. Do we treat them as we do any other user? So sometimes they have to close. Some of the streets on campus are Urbana public streets. Some of them are private university streets, even though they're in Urbana. It's kind of a mishmash. If they want to close a street or they want to take up the on-street parking, we charge them, right? Because we're going to lose revenue. If we had a different kind of relationship, we might go, no, we don't, you do stuff for us, we do stuff for you, it all comes out in the wash. We don't need to treat each other like that. We could be more, kind of more like family. That's not the relationship that we have. So I just think it needs to be driven from the top, and but you have to build relationships. That's the key.
Thank you. We're not quite done with the pre-prepared questions, but the ones that are left have some overlap with the index cards that have come in, and there are an awful lot of index cards, and I know it's been pointed out it's getting late, and I want to make sure we leave time for everything. So we're going to shift over to the index cards. The first two cards are a question that was called out earlier. There's an allegation that the NAACP, I don't know, one card says it's the Urbana NAACP, one says it's the Champaign County NAACP. I don't know if they're, I would guess that they don't both exist, but I don't know. There's an allegation that you haven't made yourself visible to them and haven't really been engaged with them. So first of all, please address that allegation. And then when you're done with that, I'd be interested to hear you kind of broaden it out. What's your vision of engagement with community stakeholders? And the background for the last part of the question is, as you indicated in your comments, this is an active community, a lot of organizations, a lot of groups. And I guess I'm curious as to whether you would see direct engagement with those groups as part of your role, or on the other hand, would you say, hey, that's the elected official's job, I'm staff in the background, and you guys manage those relationships? Okay.
The way that you framed that out was actually a good jumping off place. The way that, so I'm not surprised. I'd be surprised if, I think it's Champaign County, but I'd be surprised if she doesn't know who I am, but I don't engage directly with the NAACP, and here's why. The mayor and I, so when I was hired as the city administrator, there had been no city administrator for at least a dozen years, or maybe at least 10 years. And so that had all just collapsed. There was no, like, what's your role? We had to create it, right? Here's two roles, here's one, And so we had to create it. And I took on a more of a back of the house, I also call it behind the curtain, internal, what's happening with staff and guidance for staff, all, with a sense of what the mayor wants, but not being the person who engages with a lot of the community groups. She tends to do that. NAACP in particular, the police department. So they would know that our chief of police or our former chief of police, and they would know the mayor. They would be less like, they're not engaging with me.
So let me give you a very direct follow-up.
Sure.
I understand that. I respect that. I think it makes sense, especially in that strong mayor form of government. We don't have that tradition here. I mean, yes, of course, I'm the mayor.
Sure,
I
sure,
maintain
sure.
those relationships. I
Yeah.
treasure them. But there would be an expectation that you would also have direct relationships with the community stakeholders who play such an integral role in the communal life here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't flip it to and answer the second part of the question, which is absolutely, that would be my expectation. I mean, it's a different role. It's a very different role, as the city manager. So I would expect to engage with whatever community groups and, organizations there are and have a personal relationship.
So the next.
Do you want me to answer questions that are coming out of the audience?
If you're interested in doing so, you're welcome to. I mean, we've got a lot to get through, and so I'm trying to tailor this to respect for people's time. If you want to speak to that, it's an important question, right? And I do want to be clear, as the mayor, and I think the council would have my back on this. Our expectation would be that you would nurture those relationships. In fact, in some of my conversations with a past mayor, about, hey, what do you think is going to be important in setting up whoever the new city manager is in a way to have them be successful? Their one comment was make sure they immediately get together with a bunch of key community stakeholders, make sure that they're not, that they're being as attentive to the public communal role of the job as they are to the back of the house role.
Sure.
So I guess the question is, how would you approach that, given that I think there is a view that it's important here?
Absolutely, and I don't want people to think that the only job in government, I tried to explain, the only job in government that I've ever had is Urbana, because it isn't. I worked in district government, I was on the zoning commission, as I said, and I worked in Arlington County. And so I engaged with a lot of, they have a lot of civic groups in Arlington County in particular, and some of them I had standing, I remember one guy standing coffee meetings, and he would tell me what were the issues in his civic association. And he invested the time, he was willing to invest the time, and I was willing to invest the time. And sometimes all I was helping him with is how to navigate some other part of the government, and sometimes he was helping me navigate some, like, oh, you need to know this person, in this other area. So I have plenty of experience going to in D.C. There are some community associations, but the sort of the groups that convene are called ANCs, Advisory Neighborhood Commissions. Every advisory neighborhood commissioner, I was one for a little while, represents roughly 2,000 people. And so then the ANCs, then they'll be, depending on the neighborhood, you might have two. There was one little neighborhood that had two ANC commissioners, and then some of them have more like, a dozen or 15. And so those were where a lot of business got done, because all the liquor licenses went through the ANCs because they got a chance to weigh in. All the zoning stuff went through the ANCs. Anything major was run through the ANCs, and they were given quite a lot of, what I want to say, they were given a lot of weight, and that was where that was a vetting mechanism. As I said, in Arlington, it tended to be civic associations. But I have a lot of experience with that. I do not do that in Urbana, and that's by just the division of labor between me and the mayor.
Thank you. So we have a little bit of choose your own adventure now. There's a lot of very different questions in the area of public safety.
Okay.
I'm happy to kind of package them into a single question if you're comfortable with many-part question and then give a pretty lengthy answer.
Okay.
Or I can kind of chop it
I'll
up
take notes,
as you prefer.
and as you ask me the multi-part question.
Okay, and it's not even so much a multi-part question, it's a bunch of different questions, but they're on a related topic, and I
Okay.
just wanted to, if I were in your shoes, I would probably just rather have them all in my lap at once.
Okay.
But I make strange choices. So the first part is just directly about guns, and the person asks, in light of the recent Highland Park tragedy, I'm curious to know how you will help curb gun violence here in the city of Evanston. There's a number of questions about changing response. You know, some would call it defunding the police, some would call it community investment, but the questions about what do you do to shift responsibility for public safety to kind of human service entities, let's say. There's a question about police union contracts. And the background, by the way, is that all 4 of our labor union contracts are up at the end of this year. And so if you were to come here, you would arrive kind of, yeah, I know, that's the correct face.
Somebody's got to work on that.
Yeah. So that's a big project, but so the 2 FOP contracts are up as well. And so the question is how can the commitment to police accountability play a role in that contract negotiation? And then there's finally a question that is, that I think is different in tone than some of the other questions, but also not only asked tonight, but reflective of what we hear a lot, which is a concern about a decline in public safety, a decline, as this person writes it, in quality of life, increase in assaults and violence, and I'm not going to read all of this out loud because it's quite lengthy, but what I would characterize as like disorder in our public spaces. Mm-hmm. And so we hear all these different things, which are reflective of concerns from different parts of the community, mm-hmm. and we have a commitment, I think, on the part of the elected officials in the town to continue reimagining public safety. And the question is, how would you approach all of that?
Okay. Let me try
And I would just urge you to take the time you need on this one, because
Okay,
there's a
yeah.
lot of interest and a lot of different angles, and
Okay.
nobody's going to put you on a stopwatch here.
Okay. Everybody's struggling with the gun violence. And one of the things that we had done as staff in Urbana, you all have gotten like $40+ million from ARPA. We got 13. And so even though it's proportional, you can't do a whole lot with $13 million. But we're going to, we had thought, what if, because gun violence was such a, prominent topic, what if council wanted to do something, and just like take all the money, $13 million, like you can make real change if you took all the money and put it to one thing. So we ended up having, and this turned out to just be an internal conversation, but with folks from the police department, we sort of created a continuum of, because you hear about where the investments need to take place, and they need to take place kind of across a continuum of a person's life, perhaps, because maybe they're born into a situation that makes them vulnerable to being exposed to violence or being prone to growing into a violent person. And then there's various intervention points along the way. And it could be when they start to, maybe it's when they start to be truant from school. And that's an intervention point. Or maybe it's when they join a gang. Or maybe it's when they have their first arrest. Or maybe it's after they go to prison for a gun-related crime, and then they come out. I mean, there's all these different places that that the interventions could take place. And so to me, it's like, again, this is about limited resources. We were thinking, well, if we had our $13 million and we wanted to do something across that entire continuum, could we make real change if we invested across the entire continuum? And we basically concluded, no, you have to really kind of pick an intervention point and then go all in, go in really with the absolute best, and just scoop those people up and do what it takes, and then maybe set them on a new path. but that's not, that requires a significant investment. So I think those conversations are still going on, but that's yet another form of investment that needs to take place, I think, if you want to see real change, because this didn't happen overnight, right? This is a long period of, I'm going to say, disinvestment in certain communities, and then so now we have to reinvest in those. And if you want to turn something around, I think there has to be a very targeted intervention. That's based on conversations that we had internally, but that's what my thoughts are. But I'm still a student of the topic. Changing police response. We've also had conversations about that in Urbana, and I don't know how your police department feels about it, but our police department, the police want a different response too. They feel like they have been tasked over the years with, like, you're the people who are here 24/7, so you do this and you do that and you respond to this and you respond to that, and it's just grown into things that they're some of them are silly things that are easy to get rid of, but some of them are things, like a crisis intervention response where they don't feel equipped, and that's why everybody's exploring these different response models that include social workers, for instance. So, but I think there's more room for that. I think what has happened, I'm just going to speak to Urbana because I don't know what the conversations have been here, but when we ask people in the community to sit, not that we have formally done that, but on those occasions, we haven't formally done that about changing police response, but when we do it on other occasions, it becomes the opportunity to have a constructive dialogue gets lost quickly, because it turns into an us and them thing, instead of that the police are coming with actually a readiness to explore alternatives. But what I think is key to changing police response is a recognition that I'm not sure that it's overall that it's less response. It might be less police response, but it's not less response. So in order for, some people just wanted to, okay, let's curtail the police, but there has to be something to take its place. So you have to kind of dovetail your solutions together, and that's where the conversation, I would say, is largely stuck. We're doing more of the, I think we're all exploring, I don't know exactly what you all do here in terms of having some kind of co-responder with a social worker. We do it as a follow-up model. And we're piloting it at the moment. But I think creating space where you can bring people from the police department in and say, we want you to be part of the solution. We want to work collaboratively and not have this antagonistic thing. I think that is how we'll make, I think, real change. And that goes for the police contract, the union contracts too. And I can say in Urbana, there's certain things that they are not going to give up because they're afraid of having unskilled people in charge of their discipline. And so but it's because of the dynamic that exists. So I think there's an opportunity to get things done on multiple levels if the relationship can become more collaborative and less, antagonistic. Not to say that everyone's antagonistic. The decline in public safety, that's something I can't speak to it in Evanston in terms of what the solution is, because I don't fully understand the cause. But I can tell you that I lived through some of the worst years in D.C., the crack epidemic, and when D.C. was called the murder capital of the United States. And you can turn things around with, some of it was real focus on community policing and having enough police. But like I said, I don't fully understand the situation here in Evanston at the moment.
Great, thank you. The next bundle of questions is about financial accountability. One of the cards alludes to $8 million that were spent on outside counsel in a lawsuit that, let's just say, didn't go well. There talk about some construction projects that have been over budget. So what would be your approach to financial accountability, even potentially to claw back funds that have been lost, but more significantly even on a forward-going basis to ensure accountable management of the city's financial resources?
So I don't fully understand the background of the question, so I'll deal with it as best I can. So, and because I don't fully understand it, I'm not trying to disparage anybody that I don't even know who I'm talking about. But what I'll say is, when, for instance, we negotiated, we have an agreement, we have a redevelopment agreement with the owner of the hotel that I mentioned earlier, the old Jumers that's being renovated in downtown Urbana. And we had folks, the property was being auctioned. So we had a series of people that would come to town and they wanted to meet with the mayor and me and the economic development folks and talk about, well, are there any incentives available? Will you do a redevelopment agreement and so on? And I know the mayor would give me credit for this, so I'm going to take credit for this. We had a discipline around it. And I learned that from Arlington. They had a discipline around any deal that they would do, any grant that they would give. They had metrics that had to be met. If they weren't met, you didn't get it. And so we knew what we could afford, and we wouldn't do a deal that we couldn't afford. And we shifted the risk for the success of the deal to the developer. So we have agreed that we will basically take them out of their construction loan by floating a bond of, I don't know, $5.2 million at the end. But they have to open a Hilton Tapestry hotel, and they have to maintain a Hilton Tapestry brand for the duration of the deal, which is 10 years. And so if at any point they lose the flag of the hotel, which is not what we signed up for, then they have to, we'll claw back money at that point. But it's understanding your limitations and not exceeding your limitations. It's understanding the what risks are appropriate for a municipality to take and what risks are not appropriate, and then setting a limit. One thing I think that happens sometimes with projects is scope creep. So you just have to be. It can't happen. It happened so many times in D.C., but there was always money to throw at it, and it was, if it was a school or if it was a library or if it was a parks building, people tended not to care. Oh yeah, make it as nice as possible. But really then you're just setting yourself up for being taken advantage of, instead of saying, no, this is the budget for this, and if we start to exceed it, unless it's from some external source as opposed to internal, which is scope creep, then you just have to say no.
Thank you. Okay. Trying to figure out the order here. All right, let's see. This is a lightning round. As a city manager, who do you see as your employer, the residents or the city council? Please don't say both. Okay. I think the people. This is what happens. I'm going to say the residents, as represented by the council, but when people hear, oh, the residents are first, they think, I'm a resident, do what I say. But it's all the residents, including the ones that aren't saying anything. So it's, and one of the things that the Mayor Williams used to talk about is like, we're fixing the plane while we're flying the plane. And I'm going to take it a step further. And to your credit, you want to not only have that plane, you want to make it into a rocket. So you actually want a better end product than you're starting with, but you still have to maintain certain services. And there has to be a fairness about it. So
I've tried to instill in staff in Urbana when, you know, we give the same level of service to everyone. So if somebody says, I want you to do this, it's like, no, everybody gets the same, right? We're not doing something special because you're yelling at us. That's what we do on behalf of all the residents. And that's what, when people, I just want to be clear, it's the residents, but it's not a resident, it's all the residents.
Sorry. Almost all the negative information about you comes from Check CU. Can you help people hear something about the history of Check CU's positions and interpretations about your performance?
Okay, there's Check CU, there's Corrupt CU, there's a number of them, and there's an individual, and he is very anti-police, and he's very anti-government. And if you look at everything that he puts out, you'll see that it's certainly not just about me. And there is an alternative. I'm not going to be comfortable saying what it is. There is an alternative source of information that explains this person's background and motivations. So it's largely one individual who has a lot of animus towards a lot of people who work not only in Urbana city government, Champaign County, Rantoul, Danville, so on.
Does he do the Edgar County Watchdog as well?
She asked whether this person writes the Edgar County Watchdog as well.
Oh, he's affiliated with them, but he's not Edgar County Watchdog.
Do you know why he doesn't have
Can,
two swords all these different governments? There's something happened in his past and they could feel this way?
I know some of it. Part of it is he had I'm going to call it a traumatic experience with the Champaign Police Department. And I actually think that I think he had trauma before that because of the manner in which he interacted with the police. But that is something that he will speak of. He has spoken of as a triggering event in his life.
I'm going to ask that we move on. I actually really appreciate that you're in. I don't think we should be standing here in Evanston and going after a guy in Urbana. And I think helping us understand that there's a single individual who has a historically the troubled relationship with the local governments in the area is probably the information that we need. And I would recommend that we move on and not make this about him, which is not fair to him or useful to us.
He was falsely accused of murder. That's what I was trying to get at. It's not like he was just randomly has this thing with police.
Okay, what's that to do with this?
So I think
We don't have the back.
I think it's. I do think we should move on, and so
I'm happy to move on.
Let's do that. So the next two questions are just about the difference between Urbana and Evanston, what that means mechanically for your job. That Urbana has about half the population, a budget that's about 22% of our budget. A city administrator position, as we've discussed, different than a city manager. You know, you're now would be overseeing departments like Parks and Rec, Library, Parks and Rec at least, and Public Works and so forth. So tell us what prepares you for this job in light of the differences between it and your current job.
Well, I think all of my past jobs have prepared, every past job has prepared me for the next job. So, you know, some people think, oh, you know, Urbana's so small and it only has 250 employees. Well, when I was in Arlington, I oversaw a department. I didn't run it, but I oversaw a department that had 650 people in it, and then another department that had about 50 people in it. when I got into government myself in the district, I ran a department that had 250 people in it. I know you have more like 800 employees. When, I'll go back to the Office of Property Management, we were kind of like, it's not a 100% parallel comparison, but we were kind of like the GSA, General Services Administration of the district. So the General Services Administration is the federal government's landlord, and so we were like the landlord. And we built things, we ran facilities, we had a protective services security force that we ran, we did real estate transactions and so on. As such, we had all these different departments that were our clients. So it's not foreign to me to interact with, we didn't have libraries under our purview, but I've interacted with more departments than you all have, because the District of Columbia has everything that a city, a county, and a state would have. So I understand. I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert in much of anything other than appraising real estate, but I am a synthesizer. So my job is to communicate effectively and understand the needs of all these different departments. And I have a lot of experience learning very quickly what people need. I say, take me through your facilities. Tell me what you're dealing with on a daily basis. And then my job is to listen to what are libraries telling me, what are parks telling me, what is Public Works telling me, and to put all that together, and then and have them also. And I think your folks here work very well already as teams, and I think they and that's a huge advantage, because they do work collaboratively already. But I've worked collaboratively with other department heads since I was in district government.
How do you think your experiences in the U.S. Naval Academy and working for the Department of Homeland Security inform your perspectives? Do they align with the values of the majority of Evanston residents?
I think those are, to me, those seem like two really funny things to put together, although I know why somebody would. So let me just tell you a couple things. One is, I went to the Naval Academy and I was only there for 2 years, and I left because I didn't like the military. I didn't like the, I remember when you're a plebe, everyone's yelling at you, and then you're supposed to now, then when you become a third class, then you're supposed to yell at the plebes. And I was just like, I didn't like it when people were yelling at me. Why would I yell at someone? It was just like, I don't like this. So I stayed for 2 years, and so I'm not like a big military person. I respect the people that are in the military, but that's not my personal mindset. I don't really function that way. DHS, as I tried to explain in the beginning, I wasn't involved in any of the front line. I worked for what's called the Management Directorate. So when they put Homeland Security together, they took all these different agencies like ICE and CBP and FEMA and so forth, and they just mushed them together into this big agency called DHS. The Management Directorate was the only thing that kind of sat on top and was the glue that was supposed to try to keep it all together. And so I was working for the Management Directorate and not in any of the sort of frontline organizations. I got into DHS because they asked me to be this liaison with the community. And so it was that appealed to me. It wasn't the DHS mission or anything. And there's a lot to be, there's a lot we could all talk about with the various things that some of the components of DHS do, but I wasn't involved in any of that.
Thank you. The next pair of questions kind of pivot off of, I think, what it sounds like your job was in part at DHS, which is they're just asking about your philosophy and management of city assets. Do you support city properties? There's some specific examples given that you may not have an opinion yet about, like the building that we're currently in, or the Noise Cultural Center, or the facilities building just around the corner. Are there, what do you think about these issues? How do you approach them? And, are you involved in any plans to move the city out of the building that we're currently sitting in?
So I don't have any opinions about anything in Evanston, but so when I'll just say I love real estate, love it. There's something about it. Everybody relates to it, right? Because everybody has a place to live, so they have, there's a piece of real estate that they're living in. There's a lot of people work. There's a place that you work, and then there's probably maybe a place that you go hang out, the so-called third place. But everybody's interacting with real estate all the time, so everybody's got opinions about it, and that's what that's a part of it that I've always found really fascinating. But then I like the numbers part of it. So when I was at Office of Property Management for probably 2 of the 3 years I was there, I ran the portfolio myself because I hadn't recruited a deputy yet. And so I forget how many, it was, so many leases, like maybe 80 leases. We had leases where we were the tenant, we had leases where we were the landlord. And so I think about real estate in a portfolio. And because to think of it as one piece when you have multiple pieces that you can potentially use or use in a different way, you want to be thinking about that. I remember in Arlington, we had to start thinking about the portfolio, especially the part of the portfolio that is your, what do you call it, the service center? Service center. So we called ours the trade center, and it was where a lot of public works stuff, fleet was there, all the water folks were there, all the guys with the trucks and different things, and it was basically bursting at the seams. So we had to find some additional space to expand. So you don't have a lot of options when you're in a very built-up environment that's very urban, and so the portfolio then becomes all the industrial property. What do we have at our disposal? So I actually have a lot of experience and personal interest in stuff like that. So I'd be excited to get involved in those and bring my background to that.
Thank you. What protections would you put in place, or have you put in place, or should be put in place to prevent corruption in city contracting?
Well, we have in Urbana, we have pretty rigorous rules around taking, when you have to take a bid. We have a whole matrix of when you have to get quotes versus getting bids, and then how the whole RFP process works and so on. I'd be curious to know what the background in triggering that question is. I mean, in DC, you can imagine that there is a lot of opportunity for, as some of our council members there would call, mischief making. And so there was a whole separate office of contracting and procurement, and they were the gatekeepers, and so you're only as good as the gatekeepers. But it was having designated staff that's sort of separate from the end user, so that those relationships that sometimes develop between, I really like using so-and-so because I like the work I get out of them. It's like, no, we actually have to compete this, and we're, in where it's appropriate, we take low bid, or if it's a best value or whatever. But having a little bit of separation between who needs the service and who's buying the service can be helpful.
Thank you. The next couple questions, they're certainly related to things that you've discussed, but several cards have come in, and it's, I think, as I indicated, really an important issue in town related to gentrification. Part is just when making decisions about development, how do you make sure that you're not contributing to gentrification? And there's a specific question which is about ARPA and gentrification. All this, there's an influx of money. It can be spent on things that are attractive, but perhaps then, raise rents or the cost of housing. So how do you make spending decisions, for instance, in the context of ARPA, so as to avoid gentrification? And how do you make decisions around development to avoid gentrification?
I think that's a really thorny issue. I was thinking about it as I was driving here about, sometimes when neighborhoods start to change, they start to change because somebody who lived there and bought a house when it was affordable is now cashing out. This is how they built their wealth. And you want them to have that opportunity. And sometimes the entity, the person that's wanting to buy it is a developer. So you want the person who's selling to get their wealth building opportunity, but then sometimes the highest price comes from a developer. So how to reconcile those things? I don't know that the answer is necessarily that maybe it's a house that's going to get developed in, you buy the block and then you build an apartment house or something like that. I think that's why you have to be very intentional about targets for affordable units and not necessarily, I don't know that you're necessarily able to preserve in kind and still allow people the opportunity to take advantage of the wealth that they've built. I think that's a huge problem. For ARPA, it's a special opportunity, but it's like any investment. So one of the things you might consider is to the extent maybe you have a way of evaluating if you have the skill set on staff that something is likely to lead to a particular investment that you make in ARPA is likely to lead to gentrification, and maybe you say, so to offset that, we're going to put a certain amount of money aside to build affordable housing units. That's one way to do it.
Thank you. What were your greatest achievement and greatest disappointment in working with community activists?
Greatest achievements in working with community activists. Well, one that really sticks out because I remember, this is all around inclusionary zoning, which is when a developer, at least the way we did it in DC, if your development was of a certain size, then you were going to have to include a certain number of affordable units, and it was kind of proportionate and stuff. And we didn't have that, but we got it when I was on the zoning commission. And so I was very friendly. I had a lot of relationships with the people that were active in this, pursuing this. And they were going to, they were agitating with the Office of Planning. So most of the, I'm going to call them text amendments, amending the zoning ordinance came through text amendments. Those tended to be originated in the Office of Planning. They studied, and then they crafted that along with the help from the zoning attorneys. And the Office of Planning was not prioritizing it. And so kind of offline, they were like, we're just agitating with the Office of Planning and we're not getting it. And I said, well, then write your own, it's not that hard. Just write your own ordinance and submit it, just put it in front of us. Even though the normal path was to come through the Office of Planning, there was nothing saying that a group couldn't, kind of jumpstart that process and craft their own ordinance, which is what they did. And that moved things along much more rapidly because of it. And so then we got our inclusionary zoning ordinance. And so that, I think that was a big success. Disappointments. I know when people were disappointed, and I remember one zoning case in particular that went on. We had so many hearings about it, and it was a building on the campus of American University, and they had a it's off of Ward Circle, if anybody knows that part of town in D.C. They had this low-rise building, like a one-story building, for a long time, and it was long, and it was on this avenue, and then backing up to this piece of land was people's houses, and the university was ready then to change this, to tear down this low-rise building and build. They were going to build an arts center, and the people that lived, close to it were very concerned about how this was going to interact with them. And at the end of the day, I mean, they wanted nothing there, and so that's not what happened. But it was trying to find that compromise where you can listen and adapt. I mean, the building was adapted significantly in response to community concerns, but it wasn't eliminated, which is what some people wanted. So, I mean, we had a lot of instances of things like that, but at the end of the day, I think it fit in really well to the community. So, I don't know, maybe that's just me rationalizing, but I think the people in the community were by and large happy with the results.
So this is kind of a, forward, but I think fair question. If you were to wind up here as the city manager, there's people here, and I'm synthesizing a few different questions, and so if you don't hear me reading your question out loud, I'm doing my best to synthesize about 2 or 3. There are people here holding signs. There's a certain amount of activism, expressing concern. I think if you were to be the city manager, what you would find is that on the one hand, everyone would want you to succeed, but that there would be some real skepticism on the part of the folks who are here holding signs and perhaps others they represent. What would be your approach to that? How would you arrive and try to, how would your conduct react to that reality that would be coming with your arrival?
Well, I mean, to the extent people would be willing to sit down and talk to me about whatever it is that prompted them to oppose me, I'd be happy to talk to them. I mean, if they're, as I tried to frame up in my opening remarks, if you're getting information from certain sources, I personally don't think it's reliable. So maybe I have another side to the story which you could listen to and then reject if you choose. But I think what I've learned always is, in so many different realms, there's another side to the story. Even stories I tell, there's another side, right? I have my perspective. That's all I have. And so, but in order to have a balanced sense of like an incident, what happened, listen to the other side and then decide. So I'd want to talk to people if they were willing to.
Thank you. So to that point, we've talked about this some, but there continue to be many questions about race. They just range from what does diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility mean to you, all the way to do you care about black people and how do you demonstrate that professionally? So say more about what it means to run a government in a way that is consistent with our stated values of anti-racism. What do you have to do as a manager to make the day-to-day action of the government live up to those promises?
Well, I mean, anything around equity and inclusion in the government is the very first thing is you have to create an environment where people of various backgrounds want to work. They have to feel welcome. And so, and I can't speak for everybody that works for me, but I can tell you that there are many black people that work for me that find me to be a source of mentoring, that find me to be a source of support, protection, nurturing. I provide opportunities for them to expand their skill sets. So if there are black people who feel that I am not supporting them and that is related to their race, I want to hear about that. That doesn't mean that they get away with not doing their jobs appropriately. I mean, everybody needs to be held accountable. But so that's.
Some in the room who don't feel like you support black people, we're trying to ask questions, but we're not being allowed. I don't think the black residents do feel like you support. And I would not feel comfortable.
Can you tell me why?
Because when we were talking about the person in Urbana who was traumatized by the police, you seemed to dismiss the fact that he was traumatized and blame him for being upset about being traumatized by the police and asking for accountability. That did not feel like a respectful or culturally congruent way of talking about the experience of black people in this country, in many cities, in relationship with public safety departments, that instead of keeping us safe, kill us.
Okay, let me just say one thing. The man who is behind all this information is white. Okay. So, and I don't mean to dismiss his trauma. It's a lens that he uses, and I think that distorts certain things for him, and he takes that out in a very aggressive way that I don't think is completely honest. In fact, I think it's dishonest. And he has done things that are outright dishonest in terms of trying to break things in our government, and outright dishonest.
But not all the criticism is from Chris Hansen. So the leader of an African-American organization in Urbana that works with felons for transit society said, Carol Mitten is not a friend for racial equity and government transparency. I didn't even ask him what he thought about it, because that was what he said, that's what he made a point of telling me. And you also haven't talked about things like the disparity in traffic stops, there's a disparity in traffic stops. You haven't talked about issues, you seem to sort of dismiss the case of Ilya Lewis saying that no one was injured. And I think that when you saw pictures of her after that arrest, would definitely say that she was injured.
Well, she did not indicate that she wanted to see a doctor or needed to go to the hospital, and she was resisting arrest. She was resisting arrest, and in fact, once they got her.
So I think, I've allowed a few people with, important pointed question to ask questions from the floor, and that's, I think, healthy. Let's let Ms. Mitten answer the questions then.
So one of the things that I try to do, is if somebody says to me, like you say to me, I'm not a friend to black people, like, why do you say that? So somebody from Urbana told you, Carol Mitten's not a friend to black people. Did you say why? Like, I don't know how to address that. I don't know who you spoke to, and I don't know what they're basing that on. So I can't begin to unpack that. Are there people in Urbana who don't think that I do my job well or that I represent them? Absolutely. But there are a lot of people who do, and as I mentioned, I was just recently, we have our reappointments had been on a annual schedule, and now they're on a biannual schedule. And I was reappointed by the mayor. I was confirmed by the council, and no one spoke against me. So where's the feedback to me that I can act on?
Here, we're telling you.
But you're not giving me the specifics.
Can I give a clear example?
So I think it's.
Even take these comments from.
So I think what we need to do, both in light of the fact that this is becoming kind of a back and forth, and in light of the fact that it's almost 9 o'clock, is wrap up. I'm going to ask you to stick around. I think it's likely that folks will want to continue to engage in these discussions, and I think that's the best way for us to continue.
Okay.
But let me end on what is, I think, just to be real about it, a lighter question than what we've just been through, but I think a good place to end, which is the following. What are your greatest strengths, and why are you a good fit for Evanston specifically?
I think really and truly my greatest strength is that I see the big picture. It's all a system, right? It's your city's a system, the city fits into a larger system, the state, the country, whatever. And I'm constantly evaluating what's in front of me in light of that system. So I'll give a specific example. When I was saying about, the public discourse and what is said about and to staff, how does that impact the rest of the system? So we all need to care about whether people want to work in public service. So the same thing, and then if staff does something, how does that impact residents? Are we hearing from all the residents? And how does money interplay with our, collective goals, our progressive goals towards climate change, towards reducing gun violence, towards, just general resiliency, towards affordable housing, all these things. It's constant. It's about balance. Everything is about balance. And I think that I'm good at maintaining a sense of the big picture and then articulating the big picture. I think I am especially skilled at motivating staff and building a team. And that's something that you're very much in need of right now. And you have a lot of special people here who work for the city and really feel passionate about living here and working here and doing, really some of the most progressive things that are being done in the country, and they want to do more. And so, how to create an environment to do that? I think I could do that. I think I'm open to, I'm open to talking to whoever wants to talk to me. I don't know that we'll necessarily agree, but I respond best to specifics. Like, tell me what you think I did, and I'll either say, yes, I did that, like we changed our public input rules. We were told that we did that inappropriately, and we changed them. So I would really like, I think that I am open to being criticized, and I'll either own what I did, but if you just come at me with generalities, that's not useful. And I think that in your community, that's how you engage, is you engage, that you have lots of different people expressing opinions, but they try to, I think people try to express themselves as specifically as they can. So I would just ask for the same.
All right, well, thank you very much. As I said, I think Ms. Mitten's going to be able to stick around for a bit, so anyone who wants to continue these dialogues is encouraged to do so. That ends the public portion of the meeting, so everyone just please give Ms. Mitten a round of applause.